Hello students, welcome to this YouTube channel. In my previous lectures on history of English literature, I have mentioned about the typical outline of the history of English literature from the Old English period to the modern period or late modern period. And I have discussed something about the Anglo-Saxon period and why it is called Anglo-Saxon, and what are the basic reasons that why the Angles and Saxons and Jutes actually came to England. So let us continue our lecture with this particular form. In the previous section, I have mentioned that when to save themselves from the outside invaders, the Roman army actually, Rome withdrew their army from so-called England and Scotland and Ireland at the time. So what happens, that during this long period of 465 years, the actual inhabitants of England at the time, that means the Gaelic and Gaelic tribes and Britons, they could not fight for themselves. Now what happens, So as Romans were completely absent from that section, you will find that the Picts and Scots launched raids into the island, right? And the Celtic, what happened, as the Celtic race, they were completely unaware of the machineries or maybe the ways that they could protect themselves. So ultimately, the Celtic sought the help of the Romans, okay, but failed. Why? Because they didn't invite it. Why they failed? Because the Romans actually negated themselves, okay, or negated them, that we could not go there because we have to safeguard our Italy, we have to safeguard our own country. And what happens, to keep themselves safe, to protect from protect themselves from the invaders, that is outside invaders, they then invited another race, the Jutes. So fundamentally, what is the fundamental important thing here? That among the three tribes, as I've mentioned, Angles and Saxons and Jutes, you will find that the Jutes came first, right? So they invited another race, the Jutes, and you will find that they helped the Britons to drive the Picts and Scots away, because the Picts and Scots were the outsiders at the time. And as a reward, you will find that they would get the Isle of Thanet. So Isle of Thanet was the first section, the first place where the Jutes actually resided or settled during this time. You will find that the three Teutonic tribes lived there for centuries between Denmark and Holland. And the Jute leaders, Hengist and Horsa, as I mentioned in my previous lecture, the Hengist and Horsa, the two brothers, landed on the shore of Britain in 449 AD. So fundamentally, you will find that this 449 AD, this particular age is generally being considered as the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period here. What you can trace here, that Jutes settled in Kent, you see, and the neighboring parts of Hampton. Okay, what happens, that when Jutes came there, they actually brought, to some extent, they called their brothers, that is Angles and Saxons, and all the three races actually beginning to reside in this particular section of the country. And you will find that the Jutes settled in Kent and the neighboring parts of Hampton. The Saxons occupied the bank of Thames and the southern England, and the rest of England was possessed by Angles. So these are the to some extent the typical kind of sections or places that have been wasted by them. Among the three, you will find that Angles came last to arrive in England. So there you can find the references of Angles and Saxons and Jutes, and you will find that the Jutes came first and Angles came last. But today, when we try to identify about the particularization of Angles and Saxons and Jutes, and you will find that the name of this country is England, and it is coming from the Angleland or Angleland. And when you think in terms of English, as you can find, the term is coming from Anglisk. So fundamentally, you will find that the primary focus, the primary concentration has been given on Angles rather than the other two, that means the Saxons and Jutes, but Angles came last, right? So you can find here that among the three, Angles came last to arrive in England, but their intellectual superiority persuaded Saxons and Jutes to accept the name of their language, that is English. And if you can trace, if you can identify what is happening to them, you will find that the term English is coming from Englic, and it is coming from angle plus isc. It's a kind of a mutation. A became E and isc became ish. Similarly, if you identify that the particular term, that is England, you will find that modern England is coming from Angle land or England. And you probably hear the name Albion, which was the oldest name of Britain, and Julius Caesar called it Britannia or Briton or Britain. So it is the fundamental thing that I should discuss here, and I have mentioned about all these things. Probably it will be helpful to you regarding your study and regarding your answering the questions and information that is needed. But this is the fundamental part of typically I should say about the typical history. You see, it's the cultural history of England to some extent. Now, whenever we will think of the history of English literature, what we should read, what you should read rather, you will find that I have mentioned some of the important topics, and I will come to these later. That means in my future lectures, you will find all these topics will be addressed. And here is a particular thing, as you know, that whenever you will think of the history of English literature, there are the different kind of genres. That means whether it is poetry or prose, or in the modern scenario, we can find the novels and plays, that is drama or so and so. But ultimately, whenever you will think of the Anglo-Saxon period, the later, the evolution has not been occurred till then. Okay, so you will find the two particular references has been made regarding poetry and regarding prose. Now, if you think of Anglo-Saxon poetry, as we know that the poetry or verse was considered to be the earliest form of writing. So fundamentally, whenever you will think of Anglo-Saxon period, you will find that Anglo-Saxon poetry is the most important part. Now, what are the different types of poetry that we should study? You will find that the first thing is probably the Anglo-Saxon religious poetry or Anglo-Saxon Christian poetry, as we can trace here, because the Christianization is gradually taking place, and ultimately you will find that in the religious poetry, you will find there are ample references of the persons like Sidman or Kidman, Cinewulf or Cynewulf, and Ulston. So, okay, so these or Kidman and Cinewulf, okay, these are the two basic important figures of that particular time who actually played a big role or important role in producing religious verses or Christian poetry. I will come to that later, the contribution of Kidman and contribution of Cinewulf in detail, obviously. So there is another particular type of poetry that is considered as pagan poetry. As you can know, that when Christianism actually existed, at the same time, side by side, there is also a kind of a reference to the pagan poetry. Pagan, as you know, it is prior to Christianity in England. There was the pagan origination that actually continued to be present, right? So fundamentally, the pagan poetry can also be traced. Now, whenever you will find the pagan poetry is in work, from its basic temperament, we can differentiate poetry from two other sections. One, you can find the Anglo-Saxon heroic poetry, fundamentally, as we can find that it is very normal that the warmongers or the warriors who are actually living in abundance. So fundamentally, we'll find that a pattern of heroism has to be described in the poetry. So the heroic poetry is one of the most important parts or patterns in Anglo-Saxon period. So one point is heroic poetry. The second point is elegiac poetry. Why it is considered elegiac? Because the matter of elegy or maybe the loss or maybe the separation, all these things have been dealt in detail. Some lyricism, some other things. I will come to them that later. Another thing that I should say, it is Beowulf, the most important work of the Anglo-Saxon period, and you have to consider whether Beowulf is to be considered as an epic or not, or how Beowulf is being treated as a kind of a document, right? You see, a kind of a document that actually prefigures the typical life setting or lifestyle of the Anglo-Saxon period. And you will find here that as Beowulf was rewritten later, so the pagan and Christian elements, they are fused in the structuration of the Beowulf. So this is another important thing here. Apart from all these things, you will find that there is a particular section that is called the Anglo-Saxon prose, and it is King Alfred who is actually inaugurating Anglo-Saxon prose to Anglo-Saxon period history of English literature, and there is also Ælfric and then Ulfston. So these are the main topics from the history of English literature of the Anglo-Saxon period, and I will come to them later with the gradual discussions on these segments on these topics. So today, up to this, hope it will help you to in your study and in your examination, or maybe in reference to your objective questions or something like that, and it will help you to understand English literature better. So if you want to find notifications regarding all these things, subscribe the channel, and probably it will be helpful for you to get notifications regarding the new lectures on these things. Thank you.